Over land, over rail, over the sea. Welcome to What's Treading, Getting the Economy Moving Again. This is our podcast series where we've looked at various aspects of the transport industry and where we can improve things to make South Africa work so much better. I'm joined today by my guest, Stephen Masters, who is, of course, the over-border and project manager at MSC. Stephen Masters, welcome to What's Treading.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
We're going to focus a lot on the impact of sea freight in terms of how that fits into the picture, the broader picture of the transport economy. How vital is this?
Yes, I think obviously the arterial to and from Africa and the world, in and out, is sea freight. And obviously we've seen over the last years with the onset of COVID, various industrial actions in the various countries, the war in the Ukraine, various governmental issues here and overseas, that of course the pipeline is affected very severely by any changes in the global economy, global politics and global economics.
There are a lot of unexpected events in terms of the complexity of how connected the world is. We saw just a few years ago the blockage of the Suez and what that meant for moving freight around the world.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, if there are any delays in the origin ports, given that we are an import-dominant country and continent, or indeed from our own ports here where the throughput of the cargo is affected speed-wise because of the lack of expertise, the lack of infrastructure, of course, always affects the import and export and would undermine the ability of the economy to grow. But I would also just add one thing that we need to also take into consideration, that the majority of the challenges also are on the land sides. Ocean freight is a relatively simple move on a port-to-port basis if you're importing from Shanghai to Durban or you're exporting from Wolfish Bay to London. That's a fairly simple maneuver. It's what happens on the land sides that complicate our connection to the world.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty of that, there was always a view, of course, that South Africa was strategically located in terms of ocean freight routes. Is that still the case?
Yes, certainly. I mean, globally, from a geographical point of view, we're the halfway point between the East and the West. So yes, there is a great deal of sea freight that comes through past Africa, past Durban, past Cape Town on its way from Asia to the US, from Asia to Europe, the Med, and vice versa. Obviously, we need to be able, as Southern Africa and South Africa particularly, to be able to offer a fault-free and failure-free service around South Africa where cargoes are often transshipped. Transshipping means that a vessel would come, for instance, from Asia. It would come to South Africa, it would discharge. That cargo would then be loaded on a different vessel and it would go out heading west to the Americas or to Europe. That given as a level playing field, yes, of course, we're still very strategic, given that, of course, South Africa is also the infrastructure and the gateway into the African hinterland.
Are we still that gateway to Africa?
Yes, we are. Less so than we were before, because obviously your question about cargo moving via South Africa east-west, you mentioned the Suez. There is cargo going through the Suez, of course. There is also now, with the increase in shipping schedules to and from Africa generally, a lot of services go directly into Mozambique now. They go directly into Tanzania, they go directly into Kenya, and on the west coast as well. They're going directly into Namibia, directly into Angola, directly into the Congo. So a lot of the cargo that used to move via South Africa, because there was no other option, is now going on a direct basis. But yes, there's still a great deal of business into the African hinterland that moves via specifically Durban, Lesotho, Swaziland, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Zambia, even as far north as the DRC. So yes, we still play a vital role.
From a long-term planning point of view, though, have we done enough to wake up to the reality that many African countries are getting their act together and want to be the entry point to receive those goods?
I think there's still a lot to be done. From a South African perspective, the shipping lines are very active, especially MSC, because we believe in investing in the countries and the communities where we operate. It's to our benefit to help those economies to grow. The more they grow, the more they import. The more they grow, the more they export, the more we benefit collectively. But yes, we do suffer from the malady of an aging infrastructure here in Southern Africa. If one looks particularly at rail, we know that the rail infrastructure over the last 20 years or so has not grown to keep up with the increase in volume. That has dictated, unfortunately, a lot of the volume in and out of Africa through South Africa is now moving on road. Road is not set up to carry that volume or that weight of cargo, and I think we all see, for those that live here, the impact on the condition of the roads. So yes, certainly we as MSC are engaged with Transnet, TFR, Transnet Freight Rail, to look at how we remedy that, how we grow the infrastructure, how we renew it, and how we cater for the ever-increasing volumes and complexities of the global markets in terms of what they expect from Africa in terms of supplying and delivering their cargoes.
Right. I'll come to South Africa's specific problems, but my question is really around the other African countries that are increasingly upping their game in order to be able to be entry points. Strategically speaking, has South Africa woken up to that reality?
I think we've lost ground. I think that's a truism. Certainly if you look at Walfish Bay in Namibia, they are putting a lot of emphasis on cargo to and from the African hinterland. There's been a great deal of investment in Maputo and Beira in Mozambique. There's been investment to a lesser degree in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, Mombasa in Kenya. So yes, we have a lot more competition. And I think there's a lot of hard work that South Africa needs to do to improve its product, to ensure that we remain a viable alternative to other countries as a gateway to and from the African hinterland.
I've mentioned to you that image, if you've been to Durban or the surrounds, where you can see the ships waiting their turn to dock into Durban port, and, you know, the vista of the many, many cargo ships waiting to be serviced is not an encouraging one.
No, certainly. We do have the challenge in the ports that Durban is congested right now. And obviously we know through traditional discussions that it's difficult to extend the port because there are environmental considerations that need to be taken into play. So yes, the port could do with an extension. It could also do with upgrades of its aging infrastructure. Again, I think one needs to be very clear that the requirements of logistics generally require a more professional approach to everybody in that infrastructure. That includes the port. The port runs very slowly. It can run much quicker. And the throughput of the port would directly impact the ability to deliver cargo to the markets in South Africa and from the markets in South Africa to the world.
Are you encouraged at all by now what appear to be moves to at least allow the private sector to play a significant role? There is Filipino conglomerate being brought into Durban port. Is that a welcome development?
Absolutely. There's skills around the world that the South Africans can use, learn from, and grow from. I think the onset of the Filipino companies' involvement in the Durban port is very exciting. They bring a first world and large volume understanding of how the business runs that we in South Africa could learn from greatly in terms of how we manage, run and expand our infrastructures. We as MSC obviously have been dealing with TPT, which is Transnet Ports, and TFR, which is Transnet Freight Rail, over a number of years on many, many projects to isolate and identify where the problems are, and more importantly, identifies what resources and what steps need to be taken to improve and replace the aging infrastructure to keep up with global market demands.
But it's so much more than just aging infrastructure. Have you seen a country where a precious resource, such as the railway infrastructure, has been dismantled systematically through criminality, brazenly, without much consequence?
Yeah, I think that it is a problem that we deal with, specifically in South Africa 27 years ago. When the government's changed, it was handed over as a working concern. Since then, it hasn't been maintained and managed the way it should be. And yes, it's very true that the effect of that is it doesn't run the way it should be running, and that has an effect directly on the economies not only of South Africa but the whole of the southern African hinterland. And I think private management, as you mentioned, international interventions would be able to curb a lot of the problems that we have seen over the last years.
I understand you may be reluctant to perhaps speak more forcefully on some of these issues, but until we've got a proper diagnosis and until certainly we can understand the knock-on impacts of, what seems to be a leadership that is asleep at the wheel, we're not going to deal with it, are we?
No, absolutely we will not. We need private and government industries and sectors to work together to honestly and openly and transparently agree that we have issues that can no longer be ignored. And we then need those sectors, private and public, to work together to resolve them. And you're quite right. There is a very important role that government and the government departments need to play in that, because private industry cannot do that on their own.
So talk to me about the impact on private industry when you've got ships waiting much longer than they ought to be, say, at Durban Port. What is the knock-on effect because of the collapse of the railway system, because of the impact on moving freight via road when it really shouldn't be moved that way? What kind of delays impact your decision-making?
Well, certainly. I mean, if rail is not playing the role it should and the ports aren't playing the role they should, you mentioned yourself that the ships stand outside for days on end. Those ships have a cost to run to the shipping lines, which unfortunately ends up being passed on to the various economies that are buying those products, because the shipping lines, through no action or omission of action on their own part, have a cost that's being incurred by themselves that needs to be at least partially passed on. Obviously, if the cargo is not getting to market on time, there's a problem with the products on the shelves. The importers have a cost that's incurred because it's not going rail, which it should, which is the cheapest and safest and most reliable, in theory, medium to move the cargo. And it's going road. And road is often much more expensive, up to 40-50% more. Now, the economy bears the brunt of those increases in costs because it's the person in the street, people like yourselves and myself, that pay more at the shops. From a converse point of view, we're not delivering our products from Africa into the global markets at a reasonable price.
We recently weren't able to take as much advantage as we could have of the recent commodities boom because, again, of these logistics bottlenecks. We've diagnosed the problem. What needs to be done to fix it?
We need, as I say, we need government and private industry to work together openly to say these are the issues. And if it's mismanagement, money's not being spent in the right places, budgets not being utilised the way they should, then we need to lay this on the table and we need to say, for the good of South Africa and the Southern African region, these are the fixes that need to be attended to, and we need to work together as the government and private industry, both local South African and international, to say, for the good of everybody, to get the economy back on track and growing and heading in the right direction, and for South Africa and Southern Africa to be seen as a globally viable business partner, these bottlenecks need to be resolved and cleared quickly, because the market, the world market, has many, many options. It's not just South Africa or Southern Africa that the mining minerals come from, the agricultural products come from. So we need to contend now in an ever more dynamic and demanding market to retain our and grow our place in the world.
What's the ideal model for partnerships? Is it government owning but letting the private sector run the infrastructure?
I think that's the model that's being looked at the moment, and it's certainly the engagement we have as MSC have had with various government departments, as I said, like the ports, like the railways, to say, let us help you by bringing our experience, our volumes, and our international leverage to bear here to help change the way we do our business, to make it more effective. I mean, railways are railways. they're two steel or iron lines in the ground, but how you manage them, where you grow them, which routes do we apply, which routes do we grow, which do we leave out? That, of course, can always be underpinned by international experience, because MSC run rail companies globally in other countries, and we can bring that experience to bear here to help. So yes, certainly the rail infrastructure and the port infrastructure is in great need of upgrade.
Are there innovations, for example, that we could very quickly take advantage of based on your experience?
Yes, I think there are some short-term fixes that will move the ability of landside logistics forward. We can, look at collectively where we source locomotives from, what kind of locomotives we source, the kind of legislation that is applied here as to what kind of locomotives you can use, what the limitations are on how much you can load on a wagon. So yes, there are a lot of open discussions that we can have based on international players bringing their expertise to bear to share with local rail operators and port operators.
But we've had some challenges with some of the international partnerships we have tried, from locomotives that were too tall for our rail infrastructure to, of course, the continuing tussle with the Chinese about those locomotives we spent so many billions on.
Yeah, good point. I'm not obviously au fait with exactly what was agreed in terms of contractual obligations for one or the other. But yes, there is a very definite requirement for the African market, which differs from a European or an Asian or an American market. In terms of the infrastructure here is perhaps not as modern. We're not a first world economy. So I think we need to look at exactly what's needed, what types of trains, what types of wagons, what kind of gauge of rail is needed, and we need to have that tailored to our requirements rather than trying to take on an international format of rail. We need to sit with our partners and say, this is what works in Africa, and we need to tailor that accordingly, because you're quite right. Otherwise, we end up with the hardware that doesn't fit what it is we need it to do. Quite correct.
How much do the shifting sands of the geopolitical landscape affect the movement of cargo via the oceans?
Yeah, look, certainly there's the impacts of COVID, the impacts of the Ukraine war, the impacts of governments not seeing eye to eye on certain things, harmonizing of tariffs, or the non-harmonizing of tariffs on international trade will always affect the flow of cargo. I mean, when we had COVID, ships were stuck in port or couldn't dock at port because of government interventions in terms of safety of their own economies and their own populations. So since 2019, and we're still seeing the effects of it now tailing off, it had a massive effect on international trade. Because if you can't move the cargo from port to port and you can't load it and you can't discharge it, and that flow is affected in terms of transit times, numbers of vessels plying certain trades, restrictions even on commodities, then yes, of course, it's got a direct effect on any economy, especially in Africa, where it is we rely so heavily on finished good imports.
We know the impact of COVID-19, but were there any lessons learned, for example, in terms of how we think about the world economy and moving cargo?
Yes, I think there's a lot of lessons that could be gleaned from this. I think that some of the countries that had these very stern reactions where they cut communication and cargo and trade with countries completely. And Africa was one of those. We were seen as a kind of like a red zone, and we were seen as a dangerous continent to deal with, because of course you take COVID with some of the other challenges we have. I think that could have been tempered. I think it could have been a more staged, let's call it, restriction on trade on certain products rather than everything across the board all at once. Because, the economies that cease trading with us as Africa, they also see the brunt of that because there's revenue that's gone there. We also then, as Africa, we need to source cargo from other areas. So I think, yes, Hindsight's an exact science. We know that. And I think if, and God forbid that it ever happens again, something similar were to be experienced again, I think a lot of international governments, economies, companies and businesses, rather than sitting back and looking just at their own front porch, would reach out to one another to look for group analysis and group decisions and outcomes as to how they would handle this better in the future than we handled it in the past.
Some of those restrictions may have been imposed on African countries, but we also saw the world's second largest economy, China, without any small degree of irony, closing itself off, even after the rest of the world had started to open up.
Yeah, quite so. And if one looks at the Chinese economy, which is billions of people, then obviously one can understand that the Chinese government were very much aware, looking at the size of the population, how close everyone lives with regard to one another, that the spread of COVID could have been disastrous. I mean, you look at a place like Namibia, which is relatively big in terms of an area, but only has 6 million people. The spread of COVID there would have been far slower because of the gaps between the people. So yes, again, as we just mentioned, I think if this were to happen or something similar were to happen again, I think China would take a more staged approach to the way they did that rather than just closing doors. But I think, in terms of saving the population, that was their first port of call, and that's what they looked at first.
The world is increasingly, of course, thinking about renewable energy and making sure that we move away from fossil fuels. What's the impact of that for freight, I suppose, even broadly speaking, not just sea freight?
Yeah. Look, I think obviously sustainable development in countries and the environment is important to everybody. And certainly from an MSC perspective, we've embarked on that already in terms of higher grade fuels that we use in our vessel with less CO2 emissions, because we need to be kind to the environments that we operate in. We invest there. Certainly wind power, solar power is something that can be looked at. Electric, we're seeing the onset of EV cars now moving quite quickly forward as technology allows them to be more commercially viable. So yes, I think you'll find that the technology will drive where it is that international freight and ships, airliners, trains, trucks will go, where we're seeing a lot of electrically powered or assisted vehicles now, both in the air and on the ground. So yes, I think that it's something that a sustainable economy will look at, and that's an international view.
We're still fairly early into this century that many have billed as the African century. We know what the predictions are around population growth. We know that many parts of the developed world are facing the prospect of having very aged populations. What are the opportunities for the continent?
Yeah, I think that there's a great deal of opportunity for Africans to, now that the economy and the government and the backdrop is allowing us to be more educated generally, to go and explore the world. I think we have a lot of expertise that we can share globally as Africans. We're a very different market here. We're a very large continent. There are very great distances between a point of origin and a point of destination. We have multiple borders. And I think that a lot of international companies that we trade with and economies that we trade with don't fully understand the challenges that come with that. I mean, you take a country like Belgium or France or the UK, it's tiny. They don't understand the distances and the challenges that we deal with on a daily basis. And I think we could share a lot of our expertise in explaining to them how Africa operates, how we could improve it. And again, it's a case of international markets, understanding what Africa is, understanding that there is investment that needs to take place to grow these economies and to upgrade the infrastructure, to allow cargo to move in and out for the global economies
benefit.
Benefit,
Right?
yes.
How much are we having that conversation internally as Africans? We've got, of course, the much touted African Free Continental Trade Agreement. How much are we leveraging on deals like that?
Yeah, I think certainly we as MSC are dealing across multiple economies with multiple government entities, and we're looking at the challenges, and we're looking at the resolutions to those challenges based on what we see having been done in first world and more advanced economies with greater and more modern network structures, to see how we can apply those lessons here across Africa. And I mean, we at MSC in Southern Africa, we look after obviously South Africa. We look through to Namibia all the way up to the DRC. So those conversations we have with the public sector, the private sector, are very enlightening in terms of them giving us their perspectives on how they see the challenges in the places they operate from, import and export, from a logistics point of view, from government requirements, from the rules and regulations. I mean, we have SADC, we have the African Union, we have a lot of bodies that are now coming together. We have SAF, and they're discussing challenges and restrictions that exist in the economies and the areas we geographically work in, to overcome those by evolution of requirements, regulations, and logistics infrastructure, road, rail, air. We look at warehousing. We look at IT platforms to make the flow of information quicker, faster, and more accurate. So yes, those conversations are certainly taking place, and I believe that they're speeding up.
Political stability was always a touch point when you thought about the African continent. There have been some encouraging developments in recent years. Does that give you a sense that the future that's coming is brighter?
Yes, absolutely. I think that the South Africa is now fully back into the international market after many years in the past where we were isolated. And I think we've learned a great deal of lessons from the engagements we're having, government to government, industry to industry, importer to exporter, logistics service provider to logistics service provider. As the volumes increase and we more and more increasingly take our place as Southern Africa, South Africa, and Africa in the global market, those discussions we're having, those meetings we're having, those bodies that we're joining, yes, they certainly give us the view of what happens internationally that we haven't implemented here yet, that we can, by having those conversations and inviting international trade and companies to come and join us to see what can be done here to improve things, and vice versa, where we say, well, Africa is a different place. It's not the same as China. It's not the same as Belgium or Italy or the USA. Come and see us. Come and join us here, and let's see what can be done collectively to continue to improve business to and from Africa. And that's investment in infrastructure, investment in IT. So yes, I believe there's a lot to be done, but I believe we are on that path.
There is a growing resistance to the idea that much of the world engages with Africa, as it always has, I suppose, from the perspective of extracting value and wealth out of the continent and then selling it back to us as the finished goods. Conversations about beneficiation, what do those imply for the future of logistics?
Yeah, I think from an African point of view, traditionally, we've always provided base products to the world market. The mining minerals have been dug out of the ground and shipped as they are. A lot of the agricultural products, tobaccos, cottons, beans, pulses, foodstuffs, have been shipped out in their most basic form. And they've, as you say, been beneficiated, they've been processed, they've been rebuilt, and we import them again as finished products. I believe that one of the keys to Africa's success economically is to beneficiate and process these cargoes, that we provide them into the global markets as a value-added product, which allows us, as the African community, to actually earn more revenue from the products that we're selling into the international market. So yes, there's a lot of work, I believe, that can be done on that. And I believe that a lot of economies and a lot of governments are working very hard to beneficiate these products so that we can earn more revenue.
Let's, I suppose, come back to South Africa specifically now. We've mentioned the logistics, the bottlenecks at our ports, the logistics challenges. We've also had a bit of a small problem with power.
Yes, the load shedding, of course, directly affects every industry, whether it's a home industry or it's a multinational conglomerate. Without power, one can't operate as efficiently. We found ourselves in the recent past in the scenario where a lot of companies have had to use alternate technology. They've had generators, they've installed solar, so they've incurred a lot of extra costs. They've had a huge amount of interrupted business time where no power, no processing, no business. So yes, over the last 2 or 3 years, it's really been something that we have had to endure. But I think it's also opened the eyes of the South African businesses that there are other ways to do business, and you don't have to be solely reliant on Eskom and their provision of electricity.
Sure, but from where you're looking at it, is there an example that can illustrate the impact of our electricity crisis from your perspective in terms of what you have seen along the value chain of supply chain?
Yeah, I think a lot of the big mines that are situated here, they can't work without electricity. They can't dig the cargo out of the ground. They can't ventilate the mine shafts. They can't use their equipment to process the cargo that comes out of the ground. There's almost a complete shutdown of a lot of these industries. And the smaller industries are affected probably more because they don't have the money or the financial capital to invest in alternate power. So a lot of smaller industries, I think we've all seen how many businesses have closed because of one of the factors being the lack of electricity and them being unable to trade in the small markets that they have set up in.
And with all of that said, even with road freight, we've seen some challenges and instability. I mean, I don't have to tell you what the impact of blockading the N3 means when trucks are set on fire.
Certainly, there's been challenges with rail not working the way it should and forcing the cargo to move road. It's much more expensive. That much is true, and that affects everyone in the destination country in terms of the pockets where they pay more. Obviously, it's not as secure because a train is less exposed to piracy and vandalism and those blockades on the road, trucks being set fire to, hijacked. That's very much less of an issue with rail. So yes, we've certainly seen that the onset of rail not working the way we would like it to and the movement to road has caused complications, massive increases in cost and loss of cargo. And of course, one also looks at the infrastructure of roads that were never manufactured in the first place to carry that kind of volume or weight of cargo. And the subsequent deterioration of the roads and the potholes we see and the upkeep of the roads. I mean, obviously, a lot of the main highways now are toll roads, which helps the upkeep, but I don't think that the roads are sufficiently modern to take on this massive increase in volume, bearing in mind that South Africa is also feeding neighbouring countries. So a lot of road transport to Lesotho, Eswatini, Swaziland, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Malawi, as far afield as indeed Zambia and the DRC. So the infrastructure will creak.
We can talk about the boils, if I may use that image, from Saldanha to Durban, as we have discussed, the challenges at Richards Bay, for example. Do you have any good news for me, Stephen Masters?
Well, I think that, as we say, there are alternatives to where we are now. We have the potential investment in Durban of international companies, and one can hope that that will expand the operation in Durban and it will reduce some of the congestion and slow working we're seeing. We do have an issue in Richards Bay right now in terms of the number of ships that are required to move the cargo bulk in and out. as opposed to the amount of cargo that's now sitting there, which causes congestion. From a South African or Southern African perspective, we're looking at improvements in Namport through Namibia, with their infrastructure being improved, offering an alternative to Durban. We have Kruger, which is the new port down in the Eastern Cape, which is adding volume to the old Port Elizabeth harbour. Cape Town, of course, is a reasonable port, but of course still suffers from the malady of the high winds. From an Eastern African point of view, we have a lot of investment in Maputo and Beira, which offers, again, alternatives to move cargo in and out of Southern Africa and from South Africa. We're not only stymied in terms of being able to use Durban, but we have a lot of other options now which spread the load.
It really sounds, if I could sum it up in a thought, that ultimately this requires leadership. It requires vision.
Vision without a doubt. And it requires thinking outside the box of saying, well, I just grow peas, or I just make auto parts, or I just manufacture T-shirts. We all need to sit together, and we need to put our collective heads together, and we need to think outside of that box. And I think that COVID, one of the huge benefits for me of COVID was we were forced to think outside of the box. In fact, I use the adage that we've thrown the box away. And there's no end to what we can think of. And it's driven by passion, and it's driven by vision, and it's driven by a common goal of growing our economy for the sake of everybody involved.
And maybe also appreciating that we are not Italy or the United States or China, and that perhaps, as we often say, African solutions to African problems, but we at least must try to solve them.
I couldn't agree more. I think there's a lot we can learn, as I said before, from those big economies, but we need to tailor. We can't take an off-the-shelf product from somewhere else and apply it here because it wouldn't necessarily fit. But I think we can take a lot of good ideas from some of these products, and we can tailor them and we can Africanize them to fit in our environment, our economy, and our logistics networks. Without a doubt, I agree fully.
Stephen Masters is the overboarder and project manager at MSC. This has been a conversation about getting the economy moving again. Clearly, there are problems that need to be dealt with at a local level, at a country level for South Africa, and more broadly across the continent. But equally, there are opportunities, and those who are alive to the future that's coming will get their plans in place right now.